While you anxiously await Episode 1 of LHO vs. JFK, the final analysis, please enjoy this excerpt from True Conspiracies No. 1. The entire episode is available at jacobinbrothers.com.
The Spanish-American War kicked off in April of 1898, which led to the end of the Spanish occupation or their colonization of numerous islands in the Caribbean and also the Pacific Ocean. But Mark, how did we enter into a war, and why did we enter into a war with Spain over some seemingly remote islands?
Because we are a neo-colonialist society driven by corporate greed?
See, Mark, your hatred for America always comes out.
I'm sorry, I was peeking ahead in the answer book. Go ahead.
This could be an advertisement for your new spin-off show, Mark Hates Everything.
That's probably not too far from the truth.
But you're also not too far from the truth on how our involvement with the Spanish-American War started. It started with an event that is actually still taught in high school, I do believe, at least I hope it is the explosion of one of our premier warships, brand new warship, the USS Maine. The USS Maine exploded in late January 1898 in Havana Harbor at about 10 o'clock at night under the cover of darkness. The hull of the ship literally blew off, and the ship sank, led to the fiery death of some 240 American servicemen on the ship. It was immediately reported in both Joseph Pulitzer's paper, The New York World, and also William Randolph Hearst's San Francisco Chronicle, that it was the Spain that did it. It was the evil Spanish murderers had sabotaged our ship. Now, President McKinley, oddly enough, had urged for calm, for the public not to overreact, and they sent a naval investigative team down to the harbor to see what caused the explosion. Now, while the investigation is going on, Mark, and this is back when you could do an investigation in a seemingly short amount of time. It takes 3 years to investigate Russia, 3 years to investigate Hillary Clinton emails, but it took just a couple of weeks for the naval investigative team to determine in February 1898 that it was
the
a mine.
USS Maine committed suicide.
Yes. Committed suicide. It shot itself in the back of the head.
It scuttled itself.
It scuttled itself. So what the official report was that there was a landmine in the harbor. Not sabotage on the boat, but a landmine exploded, igniting some 20 tons of gunpowder-styled ammunition for the big guns on the USS Destroyer Maine, and literally blew it in half almost. Once that happened, the American public was incensed. And why? Because they were being fed daily information out of New York and San Francisco that the Spanish had blown up the Maine. Now, why was the Maine there to begin with? This is where the government conspiracy comes in. The cover story to send the Maine out there, according to local or news articles from the time period, Mark, was it was down there kind of on a courtesy to the Cuban people who were revolting and rioting against the Spanish government in the streets. We had a lot of U.S. citizens down there, a lot of businesses, a lot of shipping businesses, a lot of farming business, a lot of businesses being conducted down in Cuba for Americans or on behalf of Americans. So we sent the Maine down there to allegedly protect the American interests, but just as a courtesy to the Cuban people. But it was really there, internal documents revealed later, war documents, that it was really there to intimidate and show a sign of force to the Spanish government. Within weeks of getting there, it blows up. Within weeks of that, we're at war with Spain.
The U.S. military is pretty sneaky, huh? They park a warship off your coast, and then later they reveal that they did that to intimidate you.
We never, ever pull warships up off the coast anywhere anymore, do we, Mark?
No.
And it wasn't just any warship. It was the Warrior-class ship of the day. There was a couple of them built, and they were nearly brand new. They were just a few years old. There was the Texas and the Maine. And the Texas had a similar style. It was from the same class. We were on the road to war with Spain anyway, for several reasons. Spain was in disarray. Their prime minister had been assassinated the year before by an Italian dissident. The government was in shambles. The people of the Caribbean Sea wanted their independence. The Spanish government had a stranglehold on the Cuban people for 400 years, and the Cuban people had enough of it. Now, in America, we have a big Catholic population, especially back then, and obviously the Cubans were Catholic, so the Catholic Church wanted the Spanish out, the American Catholic Church. Just like today, there's a lot of Cubans that live in Florida. They wanted their relatives protected. But the main reason, Mark, that we were there, and that no matter what happened with the USS Maine, was we had American business interests there, and a lot of them. And also the Caribbean Sea, huge shipping lanes. This is before, the Panama Canal. So whoever controlled those shipping lanes controlled commerce in this part of the hemisphere. And we wanted the Spanish out, and we wanted the Americans in. It was a hard time selling this to the public, who sold it to the public primarily. We have fake news today. It was called yellow journalism back then. It was spearheaded by two titans of the industry. One was Joseph Pulitzer. Now, Joseph Pulitzer, the name may sound familiar because there's something called the Pulitzer Prize for Good Ethical Reporting given every year.
Ethical reporting. Is that what they call it?
Yeah, and between him and William Randolph Hearst, they convinced the American public, long before the USS Maine blew up, that Spain were evil, marauding conquerors that had to be kicked out, and obviously replaced by what would be the beginning of the American Empire, which kind of exists to this day in one way or another. The result of it was we took control of the Philippines, Guam, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. And we still maintain Puerto Rico as a territory, and we controlled, at least behind the scenes, inwardly or outwardly, both the Philippines and Cuba for the next half a century. Really the first American colonial outposts.
And Guam is still a protectorate of the U.S., is that correct?
Yes. Apparently there's not enough oil in Guam for us to care too much about it anymore.
or Puerto Rico, for that matter, because we just let them go bankrupt.
Well, we gave them paper towels. The key thing here, Mark, is why is this a significant conspiracy that we're covering? And did it turn out to be true that the American government lied to the American people specifically to get us into war? Or was it just a combination of events spearheaded by the mass media at the time, and also the quiet ambitions of U.S. businessmen to get the U.S. military to more or less be their security guards? So almost immediately the conspiracy theories pop up, but it takes 70 some odd years. So in the 1970s, they try and recreate the explosion of the Maine. What they come to conclude is that it wasn't a landmine, a gunpowder landmine. After all, that the coal furnace had spontaneously combusted, and the coal furnace had tons of coal in it. It spontaneously combusted. At the same time it combusted, it ignited the gunpowder and all the ammunition on the ship, because it's all located right there. And it blew up.
So it did commit suicide.
It did commit suicide. This would prove that there was a conspiracy by the media and the U.S. government and the powers that be to formulate a false flag type event to lead us into war. But my problem with exonerating the tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists here is somehow they say they proved that the stores of coal spontaneously combusted and blew the ship in half. But what didn't happen is there was 3 ships like this, the USS Maine, the USS Texas, and another one. The 2 of those never spontaneously combusted. They were in commission for the next 60 years.
Well, that's true, but if we look at TWA Flight 800, which was a 747 that spontaneously combusted off the coast of New York City, no other 747 has ever spontaneously combusted either, and they've pretty much busted the idea that it was shot down by a missile.
I thought we were going to keep this confined to 3 conspiracies today, Mark.
We had to introduce it for a reference. Let's take a break and come back and wrap up the explosion of the USS Maine.
Welcome back to Truth and Other Lies, Mark. True Conspiracies, Episode 1. We've just covered the first conspiracy. Now, Mark, this was decades before the CIA, the Kennedy assassination, many other things, before the mistrust of government had taken hold. Back then, when the government told the American people something, it was gospel, it was fact, and the American people responded. In 1898, they wanted vengeance upon Spain. It was a 10-week war. It was one of the most bloodless wars in American history. The Spanish quickly capitulated after defeats in the Bay of Cuba and also in Manila Bay. We take control of most of their assets, and it was all over before it really started. But it did change the narrative in the course of American history, given the fact that we now, for the first time, had become much like European conquerors or colonialists, where we now had our own set of islands.
Okay, and that takes us up to 1915, and another ship that we're going to talk about today. In fact, we could have called the show A Tale of 3 Ships, because we talked about the USS Maine, We're going to talk about the RMS Lusitania, and then we'll wrap it up with the USS Maddox. And if you know what I'm talking about with the Maddox, then maybe you'll hear something you haven't heard before. But we're going to start with the RMS Lusitania. And James, what do most people think of when they think of Lusitania?
Well, the sinking of Lusitania launched us into World War I against the Germans.
That's what they put in the history books. And before we get started, quick quiz. What does RMS stand for?
Royal Majesty's ship.
That's one understanding, but the technically accurate term is Royal Mail Ship.
Sounds very sexist.
Royal Mail as in packages. Royal Package Ship. Most of the big steamers at that point in time were actually operating mail centers. So the Titanic, the Lusitania, the Mauretania, they all had large portions of a deck dedicated to processing mail. These were the primary movers of mail prior to the airplane age. So they were all Royal Mail ships.
Well, no, there was also no email, text messaging, Instagram messaging. Mail was the primary form of communication.
The RMS Lusitania, as the common wisdom would have us believe, after it was sunk by a German torpedo, which is not in dispute, led directly to the U.S. entrance into World War I.
Well, how did it lead directly into the War of World War I if the Lusitania was sunk in 1915 and we entered the war in 1917?
Well, now you're getting ahead of the game, James.
Oh, okay.
All right. The Lusitania was sunk by a German torpedo on May 7th, 1915. From that point forward, the British were very indignant, as the British always are, that the Germans have the chutzpah to sink a merchant ship or a passenger liner during the war. And the Germans insisted that no, the Lusitania was a warship and it was carrying arms from the United States to Britain, and so they were faking it.
And also, let's not forget that the German war policy at the time, they were convinced that the Americans, called the doughboys back then, the American doughboys, were going to enter the war on the British side no matter what. But what they wanted to do prior to that happening was sink so many cargo ships and take control of the shipping lanes so thoroughly that by the time the Americans got in, it wouldn't matter. That they'd have disrupted the shipping lanes and sunk so much cargo to the bottom of the sea that it would be a moot point having the Americans enter the war. They wanted basically control of the Atlantic Ocean.
True, but back then there were a lot of rules of war. There was considered good form in warfare, and the Germans had already declared this area of the Atlantic by South Ireland as a war zone, and they said, "Look, anything goes through this area, we're going to shoot it because we're at war." That's what I would call fair warning, right? Don't go here because you'll get shot.
Right. It's the equivalent of now when people hide in mosques or churches and say, oh, don't bomb us here because it's a mosque or a church or a synagogue, but then they hide weapons in there.
Well, that would be the Lusitania, right? They say, well, the Lusitania is a passenger ship, and the Germans said, no, that thing was carrying weapons. What history recorded, or at least what we're told history recorded, which is actually much different from what history recorded, is that the Germans murdered 1,198 people that day of 1,959 people, including 128 Americans. The ship sank in 18 minutes. The Lusitania was on the order of the Titanic, and the Titanic took, 2 hours to sink? 3 hours? It was unheard of for a ship of that size to sink in 18 minutes.
I know it took 3 hours to watch the movie Titanic.
It took longer to watch the movie than it did for the ship to sink.
Right.
Of course, there was all kinds of outrage. This was at the height of yellow journalism, where you had the newspapers controlled by a limited number of people, and it was in their interest to sell newspapers and make big splashy headlines. So the death of 128 Americans was, touted across the country.
That's right. And by this time, unlike 1898, the newspaper business was even booming even more, because now with the advent of big trucks and distribution lines, you could now get the New York papers all over the country, pretty much sometimes within the same day. So in just 20 years, as opposed to just the big metropolises getting the information first, the entire country was now starting to get what you could call propaganda.
Right. And so two aspects of what I'd call the legend of the Lusitania began to evolve. The first aspect is this was an unprovoked attack by the Germans on a passenger liner. And the second aspect is that the Lusitania was a key component of the U.S. entry into World War I. But as you indicated, it was 18 months from the sinking of Lusitania to the time that U.S. entered World War I. And I remember being in middle school asking my history teacher about that disparity, and he just got a blank look on his face. Because people just accept what they're told, and they never question it. They never examine it.
Well, this would be a good time to reinforce that prior to the 1960s, the population of America generally believed two things: the word of their political leaders, especially the president, and also newspapers. They believed what they
James,
read.
I'm not that old.
At the time, it was reported all across the country, Mark, that the Germans had sunk the equivalent of the Titanic and just murdered a bunch of innocent people looking to go on holiday.
And that's what we believe today, because that's the legend that has evolved. But on June 3rd of 1915, roughly a month afterwards, the New York Times ran a story about how Count Bernstorff a German ambassador went to visit President Wilson and put on his desk proof that the RMS Lusitania was gun running and was carrying 100,000 pounds of armaments for the war.
So the German ambassador provides proof almost immediately to President Woodrow Wilson that, hey, this was indeed a war ship because it was carrying war supplies in what was a hostile shipping lane.
But in the true spirit of fake news and yellow journalism, they ran it on page 2. Because that's not the story they really wanted to tell. They didn't want people to tell the story of the truth. They wanted to tell the story of sensationalism.
It wouldn't be a good story that the Brits were putting their own citizens and also some American citizens in harm's way by more or less putting them, on a warship.
Now, there have been a lot of speculation on the Lusitania, as much as on the Titanic or any other conspiracy, even though it's not one of the top shelf conspiracies. When people think conspiracy, they don't think Lusitania. But there's been a lot of energy and activity around Lusitania over the last 100 years or so.
It always takes two things, Mark: an event, right? And then the cover-up or subsequent results of the government action based on that event.
Right. And then there's always the forensic recreation to see, okay, could this have happened this way or could it have happened that way? One of the things that's not in dispute is there was an explosion by a torpedo. Then there was a secondary explosion that was at least as powerful as the torpedo, probably more powerful. And so they've done all kinds of simulations and modeling. But when we go back and we look at the records of the investigation, it's very clear exactly what happened that day.
Take us through it.
As far as what the German culpability was. Number one, the British Admiralty knew that U-boats were operating in that area. They had withdrawn the escort for the Lusitania so that the escort wouldn't get blown up. But they had failed to notify the Lusitania that there was a U-boat in the area. And by the time the messages came through and got properly decoded, it was too late, obviously. Now, when you look at the German record of events, they spotted the ship, and it was reported by the captain that it had 4 funnels, schooner rig, upwards of 20,000 tons, and making about 22 knots. Now remember, this is 1915. They're looking at this through some crappy, 19th century telescope. They can't tell for sure exactly what they're looking at, or periscope would be the technically correct term. So what do? They go through and they check their copies of books. One of them is Jane's Fighting Ships, and the other one is Brassey's Naval Annual. So in Brassey's Naval Annual, the Mauretania and the Lusitania, they were sister ships, were both listed as armed merchant cruisers, which meant by the rules of engagement in World War I, they were fair game. Now, James, do you know who publishes Brassey's Naval Annual?
I'm going to take a guess and say the New York Times.
Close, but it's published by the British. It's a British publication. The British said, this is a armed merchant ship. So the Germans, according to the rules of engagement of that era, were perfectly within their rights to engage the Lusitania. Because why? Because the British said they were.
Because by the British putting out a list of ships they declared either merchant ships or war merchant ships, then they could say, hey, you're sinking the wrong ships here. These are passenger ships or innocent ships. And back then, it's hard to fathom this now. Back then, these countries would abide by these rules of engagement and these rules of war. From the German point of view, you're saying that they had the information on what was technically considered a war merchant ship. The Lusitania was on the list put out by the British. They verified it and they sunk it.
Right. They correctly identified the Lusitania by its profile and sunk it. So with or without the conspiracy theories, with or without the ammunition that it may or may not have been carrying, the Germans were within their rights to sink the Lusitania. Now come the conspiracy.
Right, because why did it sink in 8 minutes? Yeah.
Because the torpedo was carrying a small nuclear warhead that the Germans had developed secretly.
Or maybe when the torpedo impacted the ship, it caused an explosion of all the ammunition that was secretly hidden in the cargo deck of Lusitania.
Maybe it detonated the 1,248 cases of live shells that the Lusitania was actually carrying.
Which would explain the rapid sinking of a ship of that size.
After Lusitania sunk, the British released a manifest. It was a doctored manifest, as you might expect. They said it was carrying small arms ammunition. Okay, so you're thinking, small arms ammunition, what is that, hunting ammo? Well, in an expedition in 2008 to the Lusitania, they discovered 4 million rounds of U.S.-made Remington .30 caliber bullets, which would have been the prevailing round for warfare at that time.
And where were those bullets headed?
There's a lot of context here that you have to understand. Number one, the British factories were only producing about a quarter of the armaments that they needed to fight the war in Germany. They would have lost the war much sooner if they hadn't been secretly getting armaments from the United States. And what we've learned since then is that the Lusitania was one of the couriers of those armaments, small arms ammunition and artillery rounds. The Germans highly suspected this to begin with, because there's no way that the Britons could have sustained the war on their own.
Right, and this is why the Germans were becoming upset with America at the time. It didn't lead to the sinking of that ship, is that they knew that we were going against our own public position of neutrality, but that we were arming and supplying the Allied powers, Britain and France and the like.
All of the suspicions levied at the British over the years about the Lusitania being a secret ship to carry ammunition, which raises the prospect, what is Britain's liability for the loss of life that day? Because they were violating the rules of warfare. They knew they were violating the use of warfare. They were putting the lives of 1,200 civilians at risk by violating those rules. Those people died as a result. Where's the responsibility?
Well, I imagine that the British government then and today would say that the ends justified the means, because it led to the eventual involvement of the Americans and putting a cap on World War I, which expanded the British Empire. Look at the territory and everything that they pulled out of that after the dismantling of all the old empires. I mean, England ended up entrenched in the Middle East. When oil was discovered there, England had control of most of it. So I think they would say 1,100 citizens is a small price to pay for empire.
They probably would say, and if you think the British are arrogant today, the British of the early 20th century were 10 times worse. The British were always right, and even if they were wrong, they were right.
So don't get me started on the Brits. They're solely responsible for all the world's problems, but go ahead.
One final point to make about the Lusitania being the cause of America's entry into World War I. 128 Americans died on the sinking on the Lusitania that day. 18 months later, we enter World War I. And as a result of America's participation, more than 100,000 Americans die. If we went to war because Germans killed 128 Americans, actually going to war allowed the Germans to kill 100,000 Americans. So that equation doesn't balance at all.
No, and World War I was probably going to end up the way it did, irregardless of American troops on the ground, because of the armaments we provided. But what it did do, Mark, is, again, just like with the USS Maine, it shifted the course of world history the results of World War I. So you could say the mystery around the sinking of Lusitania, the selling of it to the American public, and then the long time in between the sinking and the entry into World War I is the American public had to be prepared for it. But there was some nasty fallout. The government, after that, found the formula on how to get the American people riled up, get us into war after war. And if indeed you did not like it, you would then be called a seditionist. And some people were even tried for sedition in the early 1900s during World War I for protesting the war.
Yeah, all kinds of things to talk about in the World War I environment, but we actually have a message sent from our friend Jim on Spreaker.com. Why did it take until April 1917 for Americans to enter World War I?
That's a question I think that no one's asking anymore because it's 100 years old. I think we were not on a war footing. It took us a year and a half. We had really literally no standing army. And we had to modernize our army. We had to institute a draft and draft an army. And then we had to get them across the Pacific Ocean. So that took a little bit of time.
Or is it because the Germans were so dominant in the war on the European continent that there was a real risk that the Germans would win? And if they won, then all of the loans that we had made to France and England would be no good. So we had to go to war so that our banks could have their loans repaid.
So our position of neutrality was more or less a false one. We looked at our banking interest in Germany and that part of the world, Central Europe, and our banking interest with France and England, and decided that it was better for us in the banking system if we got our money back from the Brits because we had way more money invested there.
Absolutely. One final point about World War I that most people aren't aware of. Unlike World War II, where the Americans and the Russians completely obliterated the German war machine, World War I ended while the Germans were still occupying enemy territory. The Allies, what were they called, the Allies back then?
Yeah, it was the Allied powers. Yeah.
Allied powers hadn't yet penetrated the German border. Germany was still very strong when they essentially quit the war. And this may seem weird to us today, but you have to remember that the 19th century in Europe was marked by war after war after war after war. Wars were what Europeans did during the 19th century because that was how they settled disputes. And so Germany said, well, you know what? This war is no longer profitable for us. It's going to cost more than we get back. Let's just stop.
Yes, they indeed more or less capitulated without an enemy soldier ever setting foot in Germany. And due to the propaganda in Berlin at the time, the German public was stunned when Germany more or less surrendered. This led to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the big stab in the back. This is how Adolf Hitler was able to convince the German people to rally around him and retake what was theirs, having said just what you said. No soldier ever entered German territory. It was more or less the Jewish bankers who no longer wanted to fund the war that pulled us out. And that's how Hitler came to power. But I would disagree with you on the fact that Germany was winning that war. They'd lost every major battle. Their army was in ruins. Their finances were in ruins. And their morale was in ruins. And the German leaders, although would later change their tune on this because they were losing the war, agreed at the time with the civilian leadership and the Kaiser that the war was unwinnable. That's a propaganda story for another day, though.
Let's take a break and come back with the Jacobin junk drawer. 830 Jacobin. It's not a law, but it is a great idea. Call or text 830 Jacobin anytime. If we like what you have to say, we'll discuss your comments on the air. If we don't like what you have to say, you'll hear about that too. 830 Jacobin. It's not a law, but it should be.
Welcome back to Truth and Other Lies, True Conspiracies, Episode 1, or something like that. Mark, today in the Jacobin Trunk Drawer, what the hell is a conspiracy theory?
What is a conspiracy theory? Well, a conspiracy theory is what arises when someone looks at a cover story or an official story of events and starts poking holes in it. Says, well, A doesn't lead to B doesn't lead to C, because these things don't line up. And so the first thing they do is they start identifying the plot holes in the story. But because they never have all of the information, they then start inserting their own information to decide, well, if this isn't what happened, what really happened? Americans love a good folktale. People love a good folktale. We've been telling folktales since the beginning of time. And conspiracy theories are folktales that we invent around things that we think that the government did wrong.
Or that we think that the government did to benefit them and their big business interests.
To cover something up, to cover up wrongdoing, to benefit a special interest group. Even though we had conspiracy theories about the USS Maine and about the RMS Lusitania and about not D-Day, but Pearl Harbor, conspiracy theory as a pastime really didn't take hold in the American consciousness until what, James?
The assassination of John F. Kennedy.
The assassination of John F. Kennedy and the publication of the Warren Commission report that detailed all of the things that the government did to investigate his death. Like any report that is assembled with as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, there were a lot of holes in the story. And people started poking holes in the story. Some of them were legitimate, some of them maybe not so much. But remember, as you said, James, the people had faith in their government. But the government had, by this time, started to really abuse that faith and consider themselves the supreme being of the planet, in that they could do no wrong.
John Kennedy being one of the biggest abusers of that, which would come out later in the 1970s.
Right.
Well, then, Mark, it blew the roof off the trust of the American public by the end of the Watergate scandal. That's what was really the nail in the coffin, because there actually was a lot of tomfoolery going on there. But getting back to conspiracy theories and why they're so popular.
Where did the notion of a conspiracy theory even come from? What we've learned is that there was a document circulated by the CIA, 16 pages worth, that was a rebuttal to the conspiracy theories that were being distributed about the Warren Commission report. And they said, look, if these people talk about this particular aspect of the assassination, this is the official response. But it's worded in such a way that they were really just protecting themselves. And you can tell that by reading the language. It says, well, our organization is involved in this, and so we have to protect our reputation. It wasn't about getting to the truth. It wasn't about protecting the legacy of John F. Kennedy. It wasn't about determining who killed JFK. It was about protecting the reputation of the CIA. They appropriated, if they didn't in fact invent it, but the only evidence I can say for sure is that they appropriated it. And they said, we have to dispel these conspiracy theories. So this is the document that that marginalized conspiracy theorists and said, the government's version of events is the one true version of events. No other version of events will be entertained or even tolerated.
And this is a declassified CIA memo from the time period that says, look, if anyone comes out, not just to poke holes, but to say that the conclusions and results of our investigation into this matter, if they disagree with that or come to different conclusions, they are to be marginalized, and the term conspiracy theorist is to be tagged upon them. Is that correct?
That's correct. You can go to jacobinbrothers.com and read the short blog post called CIA Disparages Skeptics and get a link to some of the relevant information there.
Mark, do they have to create a free account? A username and password to read that? Is that behind the... No,
that's part of the public blog.
That's part of the public blog. We should immediately make it part of the private one so that people listening have to create an account. Now, that's a conspiracy.
The first taste is free.
Oh, good. Good. And it's like New Jack City.
There are two things that came out of this. Number one is the hubris of the government to say, we're right, we're never wrong, and we will not allow the people to question us. That, to me, is a very dangerous tenet in what is supposed to be a government of the people, for the people, by the people. Number two, and perhaps more damning, is that now anyone who questions the government is automatically marginalized and grouped into the tinfoil hat brigade, right? If I look at any report the government publishes and I say, okay, this doesn't make sense. Now, there may be a good reason why it doesn't make sense, but I'd like an explanation. And those people are automatically swept into the bin with the other tinfoil hat conspiracists.
Right, but let's not let the whack jobs off the hook here. They don't do themselves any favors by prophetizing the fears and suspicions of the American public by feeding them 2 or 3 talking points, getting them riled up, just to sustain the profit of pissing on the Americans.
They are equally as culpable as the government by tainting the waters, profiteering on fear-mongering and creating an us versus them mentality against the government. Well, the government hates you, they lie to you, they do bad things, so we need to hate them. That's obviously the wrong answer in any scenario.
Right, and what I'm saying is we should convince people to hate both the government and the conspiracy theorists. So we are now creating a third rail, Mark. We are now going to profit on the fact that the government is incompetent and that there is conspiracy whack jobs. So we're going to create a third, shall I say, more credible, and we're just going to piss on both of them.
Let's take a break, and we'll come back and wrap up this show. Find your favorite Jacobin Brothers merchandise at shop.jacobinbrothers.com. T-shirts, hats, and beverage conveyances all branded with your favorite Jacobin Brothers logo. You'll be shocked by how much smarter you sound debating your friends while wearing official Jacobin Brothers apparel. Also find merchandise for Truth and Other Lies. Shop.jacobinbrothers.com.
Welcome back to Truth and Other Lies, True Conspiracies #1. Mark, we're almost out of time, as always happens. So what we're going to do is we were going to cover the USS Maddox, which happened in 1964. We're going to push that to Friday's show, and we're going to make True Conspiracies #2 a full episode on the USS Maddox and all the shenanigans and tomfoolery that led to the death of 58,000 Americans and 2 million Vietnamese over there in Southeast Asia. We want to thank Jim for texting in live to the show and asking a good question about World War I. Mark, any final thoughts before we get out of here?
Actually, we're going to throw it back to Jim real quick. Jim says, speaking of conspiracy theories, what if the theory that Britain intentionally put the Lusitania in harm's way, despite knowing there was a U-boat in the area in order to press the United States into the war? This is a very interesting question. There's a conspiracy theory about whether or not that is actually a conspiracy theory. Are you aware of that?
I am aware of that.
The story was first put forth in the 1970s as a novel, as fiction. So you can look at the book and say, well, that's fiction. That's somebody obviously invented that. But is that a back channel way of introducing an alternative theory of the crime without being labeled as a conspiracy theorist?
Probably, because people tend to take authors more seriously, especially if they're writing fiction.
What's that Dan Brown book? You know what I'm talking about?
Da Vinci Code.
Da Vinci Code, right.
Da Vinci Code.
Yeah. More people believe that than the Bible sometimes.
Yeah, I was going to say, he wrote a fictional book, right, which people believe every word of.
The Lusitania Plot by Raymond Hitchcock is where that story was made public. So whether or not that's true, I don't know. We haven't pondered that angle.
Well, Mark, here's the truth of it all and the other lies. The truth is, I do believe the British government knowingly and willingly put their people in harm's way. They rolled the dice, and it was going to work out well for them either way. Either they got the munitions where they needed to go, or America would enter the war. And that was just going to be that. I think it's a matter of fact that that's what the British did. And I think they lied to the world about it for forever, and they're still lying about it.
What are we going to talk about on Friday?
The USS Maddox and the Gulf of Tonkin.
Dun, dun, dun.
Which catapulted America into a series of events which we're still paying the price for today, both politically and internally, as a matter of fact. But for now, Mark, True Conspiracies #1 is a wrap. I want to thank Jim out there again for texting in live to the show. And if you've got something interesting to say, text us live and we'll respond to you live on the air. But for now, you've been listening to Truth and Other Lies.